On a wet Saturday night in May 1977, a man with a soft Mayo accent walked into the Three Steps Inn at Dromintee, 3 miles from the Irish border in South Armagh. He bought a pint, sang a Republican song, and tried, too hard, to be Irish. By midnight, he was being driven across the border, beaten in the back of a Cortina. By dawn, he was dead in a forest in the Republic, and his body was gone. The man's name was Robert Nairac. He was a captain in the Grenadier Guards. He held the George Cross. He spoke fluent French and a little Arabic. He was, on every record his army would later release, a liaison officer. None of that is what he actually was, and the people who knew what he actually was have, almost to a man, refused to talk about it. Until now. This is the story of the man, the night, and what was learned from losing him. To begin with, where he came from. Robert Lawrence Nairac was born on the 31st of August 1948 in British Mauritius. His mother, Barbara Dykes, was English and Anglican. His father, Maurice Nairac, was Catholic, French Mauritian, and an eye surgeon. When Robert was 1 year old, the family moved to Sunderland in the northeast of England, and Maurice Nairac took a post at the Sunderland Eye Infirmary. They lived in Thornhill Gardens, just off Tunstall Road, in the suburb of Ashbrook. Robert was the youngest of 4 children. Years later, when his father had moved his practice south and was working as a consultant eye surgeon at Gloucester Royal Hospital, an elderly man would write into a video on YouTube to say that, as a boy, his own father's cataracts had been removed by Mr. Nairac, and that the surgeon had been a quiet, courteous man who never mentioned his son. That comment will sit at 8 likes, half a century after the events it remembers, and it is a small thing. But it is the kind of small thing that lets you place the people in this story in actual rooms, doing actual work, while the larger story closes in. Robert was sent at 11 to Ampleforth College, the Benedictine boarding school in North Yorkshire that English Catholics sometimes call the Catholic Eton. The headmaster in those years was Father Basil Hume, who would later become Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster. Nairac became head of his house. He won colours in 5 sports. He captained the school boxing team. He fly-fished, watched birds, kept hawks, and walked the Yorkshire moors in winter in a way that the school later remembered as obsessive. He went up to Lincoln College, Oxford in 1968 to read medieval and military history. He took a 2.1, an upper second. He played for Oxford's Rugby Second 15. He kept a falcon in his rooms, a hawk that, according to one tradition his college remembers, was used in the 1969 Ken Loach film, Kes. And he found a sport that did not exist anymore at Oxford, because the Oxford University Amateur Boxing Club, founded in 1881, was, in his first year, 8 weeks from folding. Nairac stepped in, talked the coach into staying, and built a team that fought Cambridge. He won 4 blues. The club is still there. That is not a normal CV. It is a Catholic CV, an athletic CV, an antiquarian CV. And it is the CV of a young man who, by the time he left Oxford in 1971, had spent more time inside Irish folk culture than most of his English contemporaries had spent inside it ever. He had read the history. He had been to the country. He had a half-real, half-borrowed sympathy with one half of a divided island. And he was about to go to Sandhurst on a Grenadier Guards sponsorship and put on a uniform. That is the first quiet contradiction in the file. Hold on to it. The Grenadier Guards is one of the senior regiments of the British infantry. It is a foot guards regiment with ceremonial duties around the sovereign and a fighting tradition that runs back to 1656. Nairac was commissioned into the 2nd Battalion. By July of 1973, he was in Belfast. His company, No. 1 Company, 2nd Battalion Grenadier Guards, was patrolling the seam between the Protestant Shankill Road and the Catholic Ardoyne, and the unit's official record for that tour reads like a small war. 58 weapons recovered, 9,000 rounds of ammunition, 693 pounds of explosives, 104 men arrested and charged. The battalion took no casualties. It inflicted no fatalities. And in the middle of that, Captain Robert Nairac, 25 years old, an old Amplefordian, a falconer, a boxer, was spending his evenings in the Ardoyne Sporting Club, drinking with 14- and 15-year-old Catholic boys, singing them rebel songs they had never heard their grandfathers sing, and apparently, by the account of one of his fellow officers, quoted years later in a regimental compilation, fantastic with the Irish youth. The same officer noted, with a kind of stunned regimental affection, that Nairac knew more Irish history than all of the boys in the club put together. What that officer was watching, though he probably did not yet know it, was a man finding his real war. The first tour ended in October 1973. Nairac stayed on briefly as a liaison officer for the battalion that replaced his, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and at one point on the Crumlin Road he walked, by a margin of seconds, around a car bomb. Then he went home. And then, in 1974, he came back. Not in uniform. He came back attached to a unit that did not officially exist. In 1972, the British Army had quietly disbanded a clumsy and increasingly compromised plain-clothes outfit called the Military Reaction Force. In its place, it had begun to build, in deep secrecy, a new unit dedicated to long-range covert surveillance and intelligence gathering against Republican and Loyalist paramilitaries. Selection was open to the whole army and to women. Training was 8 weeks long, run by the SAS. Of around 1,000 applicants on one early course, 17 were sent through to operational duty. Its public cover name, when it had to have one, was Northern Ireland Training and Advisory Teams. Inside the army, in the small circle of people who knew it existed, it was called the Detachment, the Det, or simply 14 Company. Its proper name was 14 Intelligence Company. Nairac was not formally a member of 14 Intelligence Company. He was attached to it. In 1974 and into mid-1975, he served as the liaison officer between one of its subunits, 4 Field Survey Troop Royal Engineers, which was the cover designation for the South Armagh detachment, and his own army's 3 Infantry Brigade and the Royal Ulster Constabulary. He grew his hair. He grew a goatee. He drove unmarked cars. He walked the cattle markets at Newry in jeans and a donkey jacket. He sat in pubs in Republican villages where regular soldiers, if they had walked through the door, would have lasted 90 seconds. He learned the local pieties, the local grudges, the local songs. He sang one of them, Danny Boy, often enough that, in those border pubs, people started calling him Danny Boy back. He was promoted to captain on the 4th of September 1975. And here it is worth saying plainly what he was not. He was not in the Special Air Service. The SAS was at Bessbrook Mill, 2 minutes by helicopter from his patch, and he worked with them constantly. But Nairac wore the cap badge of the Grenadier Guards. His clandestine attachment was to 14 Intelligence Company, the surveillance and source handling unit that fed targets to the SAS. Many obituaries, many newspapers, many YouTube videos, and many comments under those videos will call him the SAS officer the IRA killed in 1977. That is the popular shorthand. It is wrong in the regimental sense and right in the operational sense. The brief write-up the British Army eventually offered the press described him as a liaison officer. That was the language the Army used when the language it would have preferred was unavailable. What he actually was, a Grenadier Guards captain handling Republican-side informants in South Armagh on behalf of 14 Intelligence Company, was, in 1974 and 1975 and 1976, one of the most dangerous jobs in the British Army. In the spring of 1977, he came back for a fourth tour. He was 28 years old. By the end of his 4 tours, he would have spent 28 months in the province, almost half his adult professional life. This time, he was liaison officer at Bessbrook Mill, the former linen mill in County Armagh that had been turned by the British Army into the largest forward operating base in the Western world. 3,000 soldiers were based in those years between Bessbrook, Crossmaglen and Newtown Hamilton. South Armagh was officially designated bandit country. The roads were too dangerous to drive, so everything moved by helicopter. And at the busiest moments, the Bessbrook heliport handled a takeoff every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was, by one count, the busiest heliport on Earth. A man who would have spent his 4th tour there from January until early May 1977 wrote a comment under one of this channel's videos in 2026. He used a username, not his real name, but his comment will gather 43 likes within a week, and it is worth quoting in summary form because it is, on the public record, almost the only voice we have from inside Bessbrook in that period. He said he had served alongside Nairac at the mill in 1976, that Nairac had been quiet and exact and unwilling to drink much, that the hard routine procedure, the long static observation procedure that the SAS would later make famous, was already in use at Bessbrook then, exactly as it would be a decade later at Loughgall. He said Nairac had been respected and slightly feared. He said almost nothing about the night Nairac died, because almost nobody who was at Bessbrook that night wants to talk about it. So, the night. Saturday the 14th of May, 1977. Captain Robert Nairac signed out of Bessbrook Mill at 9:25 in the evening. He was alone. He was in plain clothes, jeans, a donkey jacket, his hair long and unkempt. He had told the operations room he expected to be back by 11:30. He was driving a red Triumph Toledo. He was unarmed, except for a Browning 9mm pistol in a shoulder holster under the jacket, 2 spare magazines, and a radio he had no realistic prospect of reaching if he were ever physically overpowered. He was working under the cover name Danny McErlane. He was claiming to be a member of the official IRA, the older, rival, and by 1977 largely inactive faction, and he was claiming to come from Ardoyne in Belfast, the same Ardoyne where, 4 years earlier, he had been singing rebel songs with teenage boys at the sporting club. His destination was a pub called the 3 Steps Inn, in the small village of Dromintee, sometimes anglicised Dromintee, 3 miles from the international border with the Republic of Ireland. By around 10 o'clock, he was in the pub. It was a Saturday night. The pub was packed. A band was playing. At some point, Nairac got up on the small stage, took a microphone, and sang 2 Republican standards: The Boys of the Old Brigade, which is about the 1916 to 1921 conflict, and The Broad Black Brimmer, written by a man called Art Macmillan and first recorded in 1972, which is a Provo-era ballad about a son finding his father's old IRA hat. He sang, by some accounts, 4 songs in total. He drank. He talked to people. He had been at the Three Steps once before, 3 nights earlier. Some of the band knew him by his cover name, some of the regulars did not. What went wrong is contested. The most popular telling is that his accent slipped, that the Mayo accent he had spent 2 tours perfecting started, after a couple of pints, to slide back toward Yorkshire and Oxford. The other telling is that someone in the pub, late in the evening, recognised him from somewhere else, from the Newry cattle market perhaps, or from a checkpoint years earlier when he was in uniform. The third telling is that his donkey jacket sat too neatly across his shoulders for a motor mechanic from West Belfast, and that one of the local men who knew a soldier's posture when he saw one simply put 2 and 2 together. There may be no single explanation. South Armagh in 1977 was not a place where a stranger could spend 2 evenings in a Republican pub without being looked at very carefully, very early. Whatever the trigger, by about 11:45 p.m, a young man called Terry McCormick was challenging Nairac to a fight in the car park. The fight started. It was not a fight. It was at least 7 men, by the official tally the British Army would later put into the George Cross citation, and it was Captain Robert Nairac. One witness later said that when McCormick punched him, there was a metallic sound, the sound of a fist hitting metal, and the metallic sound, almost certainly, was the browning under his jacket. He fought hard. He hurt people. He could not, in the end, reach the radio. 100 yards away, hidden in a hedgerow off the lane, was a small British Army stop group that the brigade had pre-positioned in support of his operation. They heard nothing they recognised in time. They did nothing. By the time anyone realised what was happening, Nairac was in the back of a red Cortina, with men on top of him, and the Cortina was already heading south on the narrow road toward the border. 10 minutes south of Dromintee, the road crosses the border into County Louth in the Republic of Ireland. The Republic in 1977 was a sovereign foreign state. The British Army could not pursue. No one called the Garda Síochána in time. The Cortina pulled into a wooded place called Ravensdale, just south of the border, and there, for several hours, the exact duration is not knowable, but it appears to have been somewhere between 3 and 6, Nairac was interrogated. What was done is recorded in the dry language of the George Cross citation, in Liam Townsend's later confession, and in the findings of the Garda investigation that followed. He was punched. He was kicked. He was pistol-whipped. He was struck with a heavy wooden post, what the Irish countrymen call a stave. Somewhere during the hours in the wood, one of his captors, a man named Terry McCormick, decided to pose as a priest. He told Nairac he was a priest. He invited Nairac to make a sacramental confession. He was trying to extract, through the seal of Catholic confession, what beating had not extracted. Nairac's real identity, his unit, his operational tasking, the names of the people he was running, the names of the people he was meeting. And Robert Nairac, old Amplefordian, son of an eye surgeon from Sunderland, holder of a 2.1 in medieval history from Lincoln College, Oxford, responded with the opening words of the Catholic act of confession. He said, "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." He did not give a name, he did not give a unit, he did not give a meeting, he did not, in the words his killer would later use to a Garda detective, tell them anything. It is possible to read those 6 words 2 ways. He may have meant them sincerely, asking forgiveness in extremis of a real God who was not represented in that wood. He may have meant them operationally, holding the line of his cover identity, refusing at the absolute end to break character. The 2 readings do not need to be separated. He held both. He died holding both. The shot, when it came, did not come cleanly. According to the account Liam Townsend would give later, the first pistol round misfired. He cleared the action and pulled the trigger again. The second round also misfired. He cleared the action a second time. The third round killed Captain Robert Nairac. He was 28 years old. At Bessbrook Mill, the operations officer that night, Captain David Collett, reported him missing at 12:45 in the morning, an hour and a quarter after Nairac was due back. The response was immediate and enormous. Within hours, 400 troops and policemen, 20 helicopters and a chain of vehicle checkpoints across South Armagh and along the border were activated in what would become one of the largest manhunts of the Troubles. The brigade major of 3rd Infantry Brigade, a parachute regiment officer named H. Jones, who had turned 37 that same day, 5 years before he would win the Victoria Cross at Goose Green in the Falklands, led the first 4 days of the search. They never found him alive. They never found his body at all. In the days that followed, the Garda Síochána began their own investigation in County Louth. The fight in the car park had been very public. Names were known. 13 days after the killing, on the 28th of May 1977, the Gardaí arrested a 24-year-old man from the village of Mayo, just outside Newry, who was a member of the Provisional IRA. His name was Liam Townsend. At Dundalk Garda Station that evening, in one of his first statements to detectives, he said something which the prosecution would later use as the cornerstone of his trial. He said, almost in passing, "I shot the British captain." Then he said, "He never told us anything." Then he said, "He was a great soldier." In November 1977, 6 months and 10 days after the killing, Liam Townsend was tried in the Special Criminal Court in Dublin, the non-jury court the Republic uses for subversive crime. He was convicted of the murder of Captain Robert Nairac. He received a mandatory life sentence. He served 13 years. He was released in 1990. 5 further men were tried in Belfast in 1978. Gerard Fearon, 21, was convicted of murder. Thomas Morgan, 18, was convicted of murder. He would die in a road accident about a year after his release. Daniel O'Rourke, 33, was acquitted of murder and convicted of manslaughter and given 10 years. He would later become a Sinn Féin figure in the Dromintee area. Michael McCoy, 20, got 5 years for kidnapping. Owen Rocks, 22, got 2 years for withholding information. Terry McCormick, the priest, the man who had thrown the first punch, fled to the United States and lived in exile in America for 30 years. He died there in September 2021. Another man named in connection with the killing, Pat Maguire, was reported to be living in New Jersey. A 7th man, Kevin Crilly, was arrested in 2008, 31 years after the killing, and charged with murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, IRA membership, and aggravated burglary. In April 2011, Mr. Justice Richard McLaughlin acquitted him of all 5 charges, finding that, although Crilly had admitted to a BBC Spotlight team that he was at the 3 Steps Inn that night and had watched what he described as a battle, the prosecution had not proved beyond reasonable doubt that he had known what the abduction was for or had intended to take part in it. Nairac's body was never recovered. In 1979, on the 13th of February, his name appeared in the London Gazette. He was awarded the George Cross, the highest decoration the British state confers for civilian or non-operational gallantry, posthumously. The citation, in the careful prose of a military bureaucracy unused to writing about hours of interrogation in a foreign wood, said this: that he had been overpowered despite his fierce resistance, that the assaults upon him had been of exceptional savagery, that these efforts to break Captain Nairac's will failed entirely, that he yet made repeated and spirited attempts to escape, and that his assassin subsequently said, "He never told us anything." The award was, and remains, the only George Cross ever made to a Grenadier Guard. On the 1st of May 1979, Maurice Nairac, his wife Barbara, and their daughter Rosamund walked through the gates of Buckingham Palace to receive it on their son's behalf. What was Robert Nairac actually doing at the Three Steps Inn on the 14th of May 1977? That question, the operational question, the tasking question, the doctrinal question, is what makes this story something other than a Catholic war hagiography. The popular telling treats him as a one-man maverick, brilliant, brave, reckless, a Catholic boy who loved Ireland too much and thought he could pass for one of its own. That telling is comforting, and it is wrong. Nairac was not a maverick. He was a test case. In the early 1970s, the British state had decided that it could not fight the Provisional IRA with conventional methods alone. It needed to know things about meetings, about arms shipments, about who was who in which active service unit, that uniformed soldiers could not find out. It had stood down the clumsy military reaction force in 1972. It had built 14 intelligence company. It had attached the SAS, formally and in growing strength, to the province from 1976. And it had begun, very quietly, to experiment with sending individual officers in plain clothes into Republican border country to recruit and run sources. Nairac was one of those officers. He may have been the most committed of them. He was certainly the most exposed. What 14 Intelligence Company learned from losing him is the part of the story almost nobody talks about. It learned that an officer who is alone in a pub 3 miles from the international border, without a reaction force inside the pub, is dead the moment his cover slips. It learned that a 75-minute gap between expected return time and operations room alert, the gap between Nairac's expected return at 23:30 and Captain Collett's report at 0:45, is fatal. It learned that a stop group hidden 100 yards from a pub is too far away. It learned, very specifically, what would later be called the hard routine, the discipline of long, static observation in 4s and 6s, with overlapping arcs and pre-positioned extraction. The same procedure that 10 years later in 1987 would put 8 men inside a hedge for 11 days at a small village in County Armagh called Loch Gall, and turn the largest single engagement of the Troubles into 90 seconds of violence. That is not a coincidence. That is doctrine, written in the blood of the officer who proved, in May of 1977, that the old way of doing it did not work. It is also worth saying what the doctrine did not change. The British state did not stop running intelligence operations in Republican border country. It refined them. The detachment was eventually rebuilt as the Special Reconnaissance Regiment in 2005. The work that Nairac was doing, meeting informants in pubs, recruiting sources, building human intelligence networks across a porous and hostile border, was done by other officers for the next 20 years, in different ways, with different cover, with different rules. The regiment did not stop. The regiment got harder. The men who did the work after Nairac did not write books. They wrote, occasionally, anonymous letters to obituaries. There is one further question that the file forces on you, and there is no clean answer to it. In the years after Nairac's death, several names, Fred Holroyd, Colin Wallace, the Yorkshire television documentary Hidden Hand, the Labour MP Ken Livingstone in his 1987 maiden speech to the House of Commons, would attempt to attach to Nairac responsibility for some of the worst Loyalist-side atrocities of the 1970s. The Miami showband killings of July 1975, the Dublin and Monaghan bombings of May 1974, the murder of the IRA officer John Francis Green in January 1975. The claims rested in part on a Polaroid photograph allegedly shown to Holroyd, in part on Wallace's claims about Nairac's contacts with the Mid-Ulster UVF, in part on testimony, much later, from a former RUC officer called John Weir. In 2003, the inquiry chaired by Mr. Justice Henry Barron in the Republic examined those claims and largely rejected them. The Polaroid, on Barron's analysis, was probably taken not by the killers but by a Garda officer the morning after. Nairac, on the British Army's evidence, was 80 miles away in Derry when Green was killed, and in Scotland when the Miami showband were murdered. The investigative journalist Duncan Campbell has continued to contest Barron's findings. The Nairac family, his father Morris in particular, expressed in 1987 complete contempt for Ken Livingstone's allegations. The honest answer is that those allegations remain in the file. They have not been proven. They have not been definitively disproven. The Barron inquiry's weight is heavy against them. The script declines to settle what an Irish judge and a New Statesman journalist still disagree about, and it declines to centre what is, by every account, peripheral to the actual question of who Robert Nairac was, what he was doing, and how he died. There is a separate, deeper question about deniable structures inside the British intelligence apparatus in Northern Ireland, the FRU, Steak Knife, the agents who lasted to the late 1990s. That is a different story. That is a different file. This is the file of a man who walked into a pub on a wet Saturday night in May 1977 and never walked out. In the early hours of the 15th of May, after Townsend cleared his pistol the second time and fired again, Nairac's body was driven away from Ravensdale Woods. According to a senior IRA commander, speaking later to Terry McCormick, the body was buried first on farmland and then dug up and reburied somewhere else. There has been a rumour, repeated through the 1980s and 1990s, that the body was put through a meat processing plant on the southern side of the border. The BBC's Spotlight programme investigated that rumour in June of 2007 and dismissed it. In August 2024, almost half a century after the killing, the Independent Commission for the Location of Victims' Remains began the first formal search for Nairac's body, on private farmland at Forhart, a few miles north of Dundalk in County Louth. Their lead investigator, John Hill, told reporters they had analysed the available information with a fine tooth comb. Less than 1 acre was excavated. The search ended without success on the 16th of October 2024. The Commission's joint chairs, Rosie and Tim Dalton, said in a statement, "It is bitterly disappointing that the search for Robert Nairac's remains has ended without success." In the spring of 2025, an anonymous IRA source was quoted as saying that Nairac's body would never be located. A former provisional IRA prisoner from South Armagh, Martin McAllister, who has spent years quietly campaigning to help find the body, called the situation an open running sore. He told the Belfast News Letter, "This man was a soldier, and I was his enemy. But to disappear somebody is something I never ever agreed with. No one should be left in such a position whereby they haven't a grave to visit." Robert Nairac is buried, if he is buried, somewhere on the Republic side of the border. The army that sent him there is on its third generation of soldiers since the night he disappeared. The unit he served in has been disbanded, reformed, and disbanded again. The men he worked with do not write memoirs. There will not be another like him, and there is no monument.